Shalom, shalom. That's how we say hello back where I'm from. The word shalom really means peace, but we say it coming or going. So whether we're seeing each other for the first time or we're saying goodbye, we say shalom to each other. I did a little research about Idaho, and I found maybe you have a different saying here, something like boy howdy. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but anyway, we say shalom, and actually in my country it's a little bit rude if somebody says shalom to you and you don't say it back, so I'm going to give you one more chance, okay? Shalom. I'm a city elder in a little place called Bethlehem. Actually, you probably shouldn't even call it a city, because it's just this little blip on the map. The city walls are only about 12 acres, and so it's not a big place. But as a city official, we used to have our meetings at the city gate. Here's why: because that's where everybody comes and goes. You got to get outside the city walls to go and work your field or go out of the town. You have to go through the city gate, and so if you need to find somebody, that's where you go. The merchants, for example, they would get up early, and it's kind of a race, if you will, to get the best location right at the city gate so they could sell their wares as people come and go out of the city. And so it just seemed natural to really hold our meetings there, because if you needed to find somebody, you could find them at the city gate, or if somebody needed to find us, had something to discuss, they could find us at the city gate, or if you need a witness, that's where you find them. And so spent most of my time there at the city gate. I've got to tell you, Bethlehem's just kind of an ordinary place. Nothing ever exciting happens there, at least in my day, except for maybe one story I could tell you about Bethlehem. There's one story of a lady who showed tremendous chesed. Maybe I need to teach that word, okay? Chesed. The first thing I need to teach you is how to say it, okay? So can you say it? Chesed. Chesed it's a word that's hard to translate into your language, and I noticed your Bibles, they tried doing it various ways. It's a word that means loving kindness or faithfulness, but it's really much deeper than that. It's really about devoted covenant keeping. It's really a word that describes you giving yourself completely to someone or to the covenant. It really is this devoted love. And it's a word that really in our language we reserve it exclusively for God. In your Old Testament, it's used about 500 times, almost always about God. But in a rare instance, it could be used of a good Jewish man. In fact, I've got to say, it would be the highest compliment that you could give to a Jewish man, that he was a man of chesed. That being said, I've got to say there is one time when it's actually used of a woman. And here's the shocker. It's not even used of a Jewish woman. It's used of a foreigner, a pagan woman. And that's maybe the story, if I had one story to tell you that I would tell. It's a story about a lady named Ruth. But in order to tell the story, I've got to back up a bit. You see, I've got to tell you about Israel in my day. It was a very dark day in the nation of Israel. And in fact, the darkest day. It's a time when people did what was right in their own eyes. It's a time when people did what was evil in God's sight. It really was a time of anything goes. In fact, there was a saying in my day, if it feels good, do it. You're your own boss. That you do as you please. And the terrible thing about Israel is that Israel was God's nation, and yet they kind of removed God from the public square. In fact, we had the laws of Moses. People abandoned the laws of Moses. We had, maybe you've heard of them, the 10 Commandments. People didn't live by them any longer. More than that, they even took them down out of the public squares, and they didn't follow the 10 Commandments. They just did what was right in their own eyes. It was a time, we called it, of relative moralism. They just did whatever they want. And it was during times like that where God actually punished his nation, the nation of Israel. That happened many, many different ways. When people turned their backs on God, sometimes God would send an opposing conqueror to come in, and they would literally conquer the country. Sometimes it was through pestilence or even famine that God would actually, in a sense, punish the people because they had turned their back on him. And it's a strange cycle that happened in my day where people would turn their back on God. There'd be a conquering general come in and take over, and people would go through oppression. Oftentimes they'd go through hard times with pestilence and things like famine. And then the people, they always kind of, as they went through hard times, they prayed.
And so God would send a deliverer, or we called them judges, to come in and really reconquer the land. And for a time when the judges would come in, there'd be a time of peace and prosperity again. The terrible thing about my day is we didn't learn well. And it went through a repeated cycle where the nation just went through this downward spiral. The spirals got increasingly deeper and more intense. And it was a time when people just did what they wanted in their own eyes. Maybe your rabbi, or what do you call them here? Maybe your teacher has told you something about a book called the Book of Judges. Well, that's what goes on in my story. And so it's a time when moral relativism, when people are just doing whatever they want, they turn their back on God, when there is one lady who shows this extreme covenant faithfulness. But maybe I'm still getting a little bit ahead of my story. In the story, as I want to tell it, it was a dark time. It was during one of those times when there was a big famine. And so in our little community, which is strange because Bethlehem, my community, actually the word Bethlehem actually means house of bread. But in my area, there was an extreme famine. There was no grain in the house of bread. And so we had one man in our community that decided he was going to leave our community. Now we understand that. If a person has to take care of his family, you got to do what you got to do. And so it really wasn't the fact that he was leaving town, although we hated that. You have to take care of your family. And so we realized, okay, he was leaving. But it's not that he left town. It's that he left the country. And he went to this place. The place was called Moab. And maybe I need to stop and explain that. How do I explain Moab? It'd be like going maybe, so I look at a map, maybe to Montana or Wyoming. Do you tell Montana jokes in Idaho? I know that they tell them about you. Just saying. But we used to tell Moabite jokes. In fact, there's one great Moabite joke. Did you hear about the Moabite that? Oh, you know what? I probably shouldn't tell that in church. And so, but we used to tell Moabite jokes. But I've got to say, it was much more than just being objects of ridicule. They were not just the objects of our jokes. They were our enemies. You see, the Moabites and the Israelites, they did not get along. In fact, it's usually the Moabites that come in and they conquer Israel. There's a dark backstory that I'd love to tell you at some other point about the Moabites and the Israelites and where they came from and why they were so contentious. But you see, well, we have this guy, he's going to go there. And you need to understand, I know you're a country where you move a lot. And I know you're a country that calls yourself a nation under God. But we're talking Israel. And Israel was God's nation. And here's a man of our midst that he's not just going to move out of Bethlehem. He's going to move out of our country. He's going to leave Israel. And for Israel, the nation of Israel, Israelites, this is like spitting in the face of God and leaving. You had a commitment, a covenant obligation to the nation, the promised land, we called that. And so we have this guy in our town that he's going to leave. He's going to leave town. And the interesting thing is that his name is Elimelech. Anybody know what the word Elimelech means? Let me tell you. Elimelech actually means, my God is king. And here, my God is king is really thumbing his nose at God and saying, I'm leaving. I want to tell you, it did not go well in our small little town. In fact, I had a few non-kosher words to say to him. But he left for Moab, of all places. Well, he goes and he takes his wife, a sweet little gal. Actually, her name's Naomi, which, by the way, means pleasant, and she was. And he takes their two sons, Mahlon and Kilian. Now, I've got to tell you, it was a tough time. It was a time where there was extreme famine. I've got to tell you, Mahlon and Kilian, I think they were born during a time when I don't think they got enough nourishment in their mother's cooker, if you know what I mean. They needed these skinny little scrawny kids. They needed some more falafel and things like that. But anyway, they're frail kids. But he takes his family, he moves to Moab, and there in Moab, things did not go well. I've got to say, we had a saying that the grass is not always greener on the other side of the ravine. And it certainly wasn't in Moab. In fact, as things didn't go well, you might, how do you say it in your language? I think you outstruck. No, that's not quite right. I think it struck out. And really that's what happens here. You see, the first thing that happens when they move to Moab, they're there for a little while. But the first thing that happens is Elimelech dies. And he leaves Naomi as a widow. Strike one. Well, strike two, these two boys, they marry. and they marry foreign girls. Strike two. Now, let me explain that a little bit. God's law says you're not supposed to marry a foreigner. And it's not because of some racist thing. It's because foreigners, they worshiped foreign gods. They worshiped idols. And God's purpose was to keep Israel pure and clean and to really bring a Messiah out of that. And so he didn't want you to marry foreign women because foreign women meant foreign gods and a different religion. And these boys, Mahlon and Chilion, they actually marry foreign girls. We get Orpah. Don't be saying Oprah. That's somebody different. And Ruth. And then something else happens. Mahlon and Chilion, I told you they're a little sickly. They actually both die. Strike three. Here's why. Naomi's in a foreign country, in a foreign land, and has two widowed daughters-in-law. And just imagine that. Now, in my day, we used to tell mother-in-law jokes. Do you ever do that? There's this great story. There was this one mother-in-law who, you know what, I better not tell that story either. Anyway, you can imagine this terrible situation. The problem is, in my day, widows were in desperate straits. You see, we didn't have, and I don't know if I get this right, but we didn't have an SS card. I'm not sure what that is. But you have something called Social Security. That didn't happen in my day. And the truth of the matter is, if Naomi had been back in Israel, God had a plan, and it was a good one. God had a plan for taking care of widows, but without that plan, I've got to tell you, widows were not only often overlooked and neglected, widows were, can I say this in church? They were abused. And here we have Naomi and two daughters-in-law in that kind of situation. And while God had a plan for taking care of widows, Moab didn't. And so we get Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, they're in desperate straits. You see, if they'd been in Israel, here was God's plan. God's plan, first of all, is the fact that a wife can be taken care of by her husband's estate. But the problem is that an estate can only be passed down by a male child. And so that plan actually, we understand that Naomi, her sons are dead. And so she can't receive the inheritance. But God still had another plan. And the other plan was this. It was called a kinsman redeemer, where if a man dies, his brother has an obligation to a woman if she has no children who can take care of her. And so God had laid this out. And in fact, God had this provision also, that in one of the commandments it says this: honor your father and mother so your days on earth will be blessed, right? Well, that was part of God's provision. You see, here's what that really means. Honor your parents, and when they get old, you're supposed to take care of them. And so part of God's provision was not only having an inheritance passed down through generations, but children were supposed to take care of their parents. And the promise was this: you take care of your parents, you honor your parents, and then when you're old, your kids will take care of you. And so you honor your parents, and so your days can be long on the earth. And so God had a plan for this, not only through passing down of inheritance, but children taking care of their parents. And, well, Naomi has a problem here too, because her sons have died. Well, the kinsman redeemer, if a man had a brother, his brother was supposed to take care of him, but Elimelech didn't have any brothers. The law also provided for okay, if a man doesn't have any brothers, it could be a next closest relative that didn't have to, but could come in and redeem this family. But Naomi, well, she can't even think of a close relative. And so things are tough, and yet God still had a provision. Even in those circumstances, if everything else above failed, in Israel, there was still provision. The provision was this: it was called gleaning. And there were specific laws about when a person was harvesting, not to harvest the edge of his fields. And so people who were destitute, they could come and they could harvest from the corners of the field. And more than that, actually, even in the middle of the field, if something fell as it was being harvested, you weren't supposed to pick it up. And that allowed people to come in and glean. And in my day, if a person didn't work, they weren't supposed to eat. Now, there were still provisions for the needy, the people that couldn't take care of themselves, the people that were handicapped or deficient. But really, the law required, if you want to eat, you've got to work. And so God had this plan about going into a field and gleaning. And so if Naomi had been back in Israel, God would have a plan for taking care of her, but she finds herself a widow with 2 widowed daughters-in-law, and they really were destitute. Moab had no such laws. It's also about that time, however, that we realize that Israel had kind of gone through a time of repentance, and God had removed the famine and started blessing the land of Israel once again. And so Naomi starts hearing about how things are going well back in Israel, and so she has this thought, I should go back home. The problem is she's got 2 daughters-in-law that they really are foreigners. And if they go back, they worship false gods. If they go back, they are going to be the objects of ridicule. If they go back, people will despise them because the Moabites, they really are Israel's enemies. And so what does a woman do? She actually goes to her daughters-in-law and she says, here's what you need to do. I don't have any sons who you can marry. I've got no plan for you, but I'm going to go back home. And so what you need to do is you need to go back to your mother's house. An interesting term, by the way. You need to go back to your mother's house, and maybe there's somebody there that can take care of you, and maybe even be married again, but you need to go back and be with your own kind. And so at that point, after much weeping and crying, Orpah actually decides that's what she should do, and she leaves. But not Ruth, which brings us back to our story. Ruth is this lady that has this covenant commitment. Ruth actually, she utters at this point a phrase that becomes very popular in my day. We remember the phrase where Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I'll even be buried with you. And you need to understand these words of Ruth. She's really saying, I'll leave my people. I'll leave my kind. I'll leave my father and mother. I'll even leave my religion. And I'll follow you. I will leave my people, and I will go, and I will stay with you. I'll be devoted to you, and I will follow your God. Your God will be my God. And I'll even become, in your land, the object of ridicule because I know I'm not one of you. Do you understand what Ruth is saying? Ruth makes a commitment, a covenant commitment, a devoted love. Ruth saying to Naomi, I'll stay with you. It's an amazing statement. And that's where I come in. I remember the day. Like normal, I was at the city gate, and at the city gate, all of a sudden there was this huge commotion. And I thought, hey, there must be a stable sale going on. I think maybe you call those garage sales or something. But everybody, they're running around and they're kind of frantic. I think, man, what's going on? Again, a sleepy little town, Bethlehem, not much happens there. And then at a distance, I see her. And I recognize her. She is aged. It's been a while. It's been a decade since I've seen her. But the years have been hard on her. But I recognize her and I cry out to her, Naomi, Naomi. And as she comes near, she's got this sweet young girl with her. But Naomi looks at me and says, don't call me Naomi. She says, when I left here, I was full, but I've come back empty. You need to call me Mara, which means bitter. It had been a hard life. And it's really interesting because at that point, Ruth did something rather interesting. Ruth actually decided that she was going to take care of this family, the family unit. She was going to provide for it. And so she actually went to a nearby field, and there she was going to glean for Naomi. Now, here's the problem. In Israel, that law was for Israelites. They had some provision for foreigners, but there's no telling how Ruth is going to be treated in one of these fields. But she goes anyway. She's going to provide for her mother-in-law. And so she goes to a field, and by chance, she happens to a field of Boaz. Now let me just tell you a little bit about Boaz. Boaz, his name actually means strength with speed. That's a great name, isn't it? Swift strength. That's Boaz. But more than that, I got to tell you a couple other things about Boaz. First of all, Boaz is a wealthy man. He's a landowner. He's got people that work on his land. I don't know really how to describe this, but maybe I could say he was the Joe Simplot of the day. But not only that, I should tell you, did I say he was single and he's wealthy? But also I need to tell you about this. Boaz, we'd say it in our language, he'd get good bowels. Well, maybe that doesn't translate well. maybe, I think it's kind of strange, but you might say it kind of a crude way. He had a big heart. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Anyway, that's how we said it. His bowels gushed. He was a man that, he had your language kind of strange. He had a big heart. But anyway, that's the kind of man he was. And Boaz actually looks out in his field and he sees Ruth. Now remember, there's no telling how somebody might treat Ruth. She's a Moabite. But Boaz, with his big heart, he looks out there and he allows her to glean the field. In fact, he kind of watches for a while. And Boaz, at the end of the day, he actually goes up and does something strange to Ruth. He actually goes to Ruth and says, Ruth, it would be okay if you came back to my field tomorrow to glean. Now, that might not relate to you, but the law of Moses was pretty specific that a gleaner cannot return back to the same field. Actually, they're supposed to go a great distance away, and that way one person is really not taking care of all of the needy. The responsibility is kind of shared around. And so a gleaner, they were able to go and glean from the edges of the field or from what's fallen on the ground, but they couldn't do it in the same field twice. But Boaz has compassion on her, and so he says, you can come back here. And by the way, Ruth, you can kind of even come and visit the water cooler if you want. And then actually he tells his workers a few things. He says, you can just drop a little bit more than normal. And so Ruth is actually coming back. He's going to come back to the field. And the next day, Boaz has been thinking about this. And in fact, his heart was big. He actually is thinking lunch plans. And so here's what's going to happen. He's actually going to say, Ruth, you can actually work right alongside the gleaners. Not the gleaners. Rather than gleaning, you can actually work right alongside the laborers. And you can go to the water cooler and things at my disposal. You can do that. And by the way, he told all his workers, no more Moabite jokes. And so they can't tell any more jokes. And that day, Ruth goes home with so much. She's got days and days and days of supplies. And so she takes that back to Naomi. And she's saying, oh, you wouldn't believe it. There's this guy here that treated me well. And look how much I have. And she mentions his name, Boaz. And all of a sudden, Naomi, man, she's elated. Oh, Hesed, Hesed, Hesed. Oh, God's provision, God's faithfulness. And she's getting excited. I need to probably stop and explain some things here. It's not just the amount of food that's going on. It's also not just this woman-man thing that's maybe going on too. It's the thought of Boaz. You see, she'd forgotten. She does have a distant relative there. Boaz, he could be a kinsman redeemer. He's not a brother, but he is a relative, and he really could redeem Elimelech's property. And if Boaz was willing, here's access all of a sudden to her dead husband's estate. And this could be God providing through Boaz. And so her mind's racing. Oh, how do we do this? And she's thinking grandchildren. There's something about grandbabies that do something to women, at least in my day. But she's got this plan. Boaz has been thinking too. And so Naomi comes up with this plan. Ruth, it's barley harvesting time. Boaz, he's going to be at, how do you say the word in your language? It's kind of a high spot on a hill. And you take all your crops there and you throw the barley up in the air. And when the wind blows, the husk is blown away and it just leaves the grain. Oh, you call it a threshing floor. You go to the threshing floor, and there on the threshing floor, you need to go and you need to wait. And here's what I want you to do. When it comes nightfall, what I want you to do is I want you to lay down at Boaz's feet, and I want you to ask if you can be covered by his blanket. Now, I know that sounds strange to you, but let me explain what's going on. The threshing floor, it's a community place. Lots and lots of people come. And you go to the harvest fields during the day, and so you're harvesting your crops. And then you go there and you bring all your crops there, and the whole community is coming there to the threshing floor, a place really designed for this. And you've got to wait for a couple things. First of all, you've got to wait for the wind to blow. And so you're waiting for the wind to blow. Not only that, you've got to wait for your turn. And so when the community's there and harvest is all the same time for everybody's there and they're waiting at the evening and into the morning. They're waiting for the wind to blow, and so they can do this, the threshing at the threshing floor. And so there's lots of people there. And when it gets late and it starts getting cold, Ruth is supposed to go up by Naomi's advice and say, Boaz, can I be can I be covered by your blanket?
Now, really what she's saying is this: I would like to be your servant, and I would like to come under your protection. And that's what's going on. And so it's interesting what Boaz says. Ruth does exactly that. She goes up and says, can I be covered by your blanket? Can I be under your protection? And Boaz actually says, oh, the Lord bless you. This hesed is greater than the first. Do you understand what he says? He uses the word hesed, your covenant faithfulness. He had earlier said, look, I've heard about the story and how you've stuck with Naomi, even though you didn't need to, and even though you came here and accepted our people, and you came here to this place where you may not be accepted. Ruth, I've heard that story. And the blessing, Lord bless you. Your kindness, your hesed is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after younger men, rich or poor. I'll do what you ask. I'm going to go and tell all my fellow townsmen and let them know that you are a woman of noble character, which points out that there's nothing flaky going on here. Ruth is saying, I want to come and I want to be part of your household servants. And Boaz says, I got something better in store for you. You see, he's been thinking too. He wants to take Ruth as his wife. And so here's what he does. Boaz, this man of swift strength, he goes immediately and he comes to the city gate. Why? Because that's where the elders of the town are. And we're there and he comes to find us. And no one would have thought any different if Boaz would have simply come and said, look, I want to redeem Naomi and I want to redeem Ruth. And we'd have thought, hey, that's great. But Boaz, he's a man of great character. See, he actually realizes that he's not the closest living relative. And so he actually goes and finds that man, and we had the meeting at the city gates. And Boaz actually explains to this closer relative, hey, you remember Elimelech? Well, of course, we're related. Well, you remember that he has a field and he has inheritance that needs to be passed down. And of course he says, of course I know that. Well, you know he's dead. Well, yeah, I know that. Well, you're the closest in line. You could redeem that field and get those possessions. And so the guy actually says, I think I will. And so he's going to become the redeemer. And yet Boaz stops and says, now understand, with that comes responsibility. There's Naomi. You need to take care of Naomi. Well, of course I need to take care of Naomi. And then Boaz adds, and her daughter-in-law, the foreigner. At which the man says, I'm out. I'm not going to do that. And so Boaz says, so then can I be the redeemer? Well, of course you can. And quicker than you can say baklava, he actually takes off his sandal and he hands it to the city elders. You guys look puzzled. Maybe I should explain that sandal bit. You see, that's how we sign covenants. You give a piece of your property, you give something that's very important to you, you give that as a sign and a seal of the covenant. And so Boaz takes off, as was customary, his sandal, and he gives it saying, I will follow through with this. And I've got to tell you, that is quite a commitment, not only walking around in rocks and stuff like that, but this is the day before odor eaters. Anyway, he hands the sandal there, and Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer. And I've got to tell you, all this took place in a very dark time in the nation of Israel, when everyone was thinking about themselves and they were doing what was right in their own eyes and what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And yet Boaz stands up as a person of noble character, and he does exactly the right thing. And I've got to tell you, even more than that, we get Ruth. Ruth, a person who demonstrates hesed, the faithfulness of God, this commitment to say, I'll do whatever it takes, I'll go with you and I'll stand by you through thick and thin, even if it means great cost to me. Ruth becomes this person, even outside of Israel, of chesed. And I want to tell you, even during those dark times, when people abandoned God, when people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, even when people forsook the law of Moses and they practiced all kinds of gross sexuality and alternative lifestyles, even when people were doing things that were detestable in the sight of God, God was still working out his plan. And what was a very ordinary
city became a very important city. And a woman who was just a very ordinary woman, in fact, not even a Jew, became an extraordinary person. And I've got to tell you what happened. Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth for 10 years had been childless, even though she'd been married before. And God opened up her womb, and Boaz and Ruth actually have a son. His name's Obed, which means God's faithful. And as the story goes, Obed also grows up and he gets married and he has a son, and his son's name is Jesse. And by the way, Jesse grows up and he has a son who becomes king. His name's David. And see, God had been working out his plan. Even in times when things were very corrupt, in a time of moral relativism, when people just did what they wanted and abandoned God, God was still working out his plan. And he took a very ordinary place. He took a very ordinary woman and did something extraordinary. And I've got to stop and say, Hesed, it's hard to practice anytime. But Hesed, it's really hard to practice when people live in a world where they're just looking at it for themselves and doing their own thing and doing what's right in their own eyes. But I want to tell you this, that God honors people of chesed. God honors people who are going to do the right thing, who are going to be committed. They're going to be people of covenant faithfulness. And God can take ordinary people who practice chesed, and God can take an ordinary woman who practices chesed and can use that person to do something extraordinary. And I want to tell you, here's the case. In a day and age like mine, when people did what was right in their own eyes and abandoned godly principles, in a dark time in Israel's history, God was still working out his plan, but God works out his plan through men and women, ordinary men and women who are willing to take up a stand and say, I will follow God, I will be committed, I will be loyal, I'll be faithful, I'll be devoted. God can take those kind of people and accomplish the extraordinary because of their faithfulness. And I'm just wondering, is there anyone in your day and age who would be willing to practice chesed?